Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's certainly morning in Glasgow. I'm in London, and if Glasgow is in any way similar, you are blessed with a sunny morning, I hope, for all of you. Welcome to this event on climate change and conflict, prevention, foresight, resilience, and adaptation of populations at risk, organized by the European Union. Is one of the official side events of the European Union at COP. So we're going to talk about the relationship between climate change and conflict, and violence and fragility. And let me begin by saying that I think we can all agree to start with that it is, of course, a quite complex relationship that we're talking about. And one thing that we're going to do over the next hour or so is try to avoid simplifying this relationship too much down to easy and linear causal relationship. So whether climate change and environmental degradation causes conflict is, of course, something that is up for debate. But let's agree that there is indeed a relationship between the two, and that while that may not be causal, that narratives around, and of course there are narratives around securitizing climate change that can also be harmful to trying to get to some kind of operational discussions about what can we do to minimize the risks and for all those involved. There is indeed evidence that there is a relationship between the two, and that often that is combined with a number of other socioeconomic and governance factors. Some recent research that ODI, that is the organization I work for, I'm the executive director for ODI Europe. ODI is a London-based think tank that works on global issues, including, of course, and very much in the next couple of weeks, focusing on climate change. So recent research that ODI and others have conducted show that, for example, is not necessarily employment on its own that is a consideration when it comes to causal fragility, but it's, for example, earning power. So it can be different aspects of socioeconomic issues that indeed have an effect on conflict and violence, and not necessarily on and of itself loss of agricultural livelihoods and other aspects directly related to climate change. Yet climate change indirectly undermines definitely peace and stability by exacerbating some of the factors that can be already at play that ultimately can lead to violence and deterioration of national and international peace and security. So we're here today to discuss the nature of those relationships and how they can be minimized and better managed. At the recent UN Security Council debate on climate change, it was actually the UN Secretary General, who, of course, at COP as we speak, who highlighted these important issues and relationships by saying that where coping capacities are limited and there is high dependence on shrinking natural resources and ecosystem services, such as water and fertile land, grievances and tensions can explode, complicating efforts to prevent conflict and sustain peace. So this is another interesting perspective, which is, of course, that environmental degradations may undermine ongoing effort to sustain peace and address fragility. The outbreak and persistence of conflict can significantly affect the adaptive capacity of individuals and communities. And this is another important perspective. We're hearing a lot about the importance of adaptation strategies to address the reality of climate change. And so conflict and fragility can undermine this. And this is something where at ODI, together with the ICRC, we've shed some light through a global series of roundtable that have highlighted the presence of the so-called double vulnerability, where populations are impacted by both conflict and climate risk. And we are working to increase understanding on how that works and what can be done for those populations that are affected by these multiple threats and things that undermine their livelihoods and indeed their lives. So drawing on the engagement in regions affected by climate change and conflict around the world, today we're lucky to have representatives from the European Union, from the Potsdam Institute for Climate and Impact Research, and from the International Committee of the Red Cross, who can explore the broad scope of this relationship between conflict and climate change. And we have them all on the panel, and I will introduce them to you all in a minute. They will share with us their work and their reflections, and hopefully also give us a sense about what to expect over the next couple of weeks during COP26 to really improve the conditions, particularly the living conditions of those who are threatened by who are vulnerable to climate change and conflict in ways that affect their livelihoods. This event actually lays the groundwork for another side event on a similar topic entitled Climate, Peace and Stability, Weathering Risk Through COP and Beyond, which will take place this afternoon in the German pavilion. Will bring together high-level officials from around the world to build multilateral momentum for advancing sustainable peace and stability. So it's great to see that over the next couple of weeks, there will be effort across the national pavilions and hopefully inside the Blue Zone to address the issues of conflict and climate. And this was indeed the theme of ODI's sort of opening event yesterday for those who followed it. Can I ask the speakers to please mute yourself unless you're speaking and to respect the time limit? I'm going to try for us to have a conversation, however virtual this can be. So I'll ask all of you to make an initial intervention, and then I'll come back to each of you with the questions, and then we will have questions from the public, from the audience. So after the speakers have shared their insights, we will take questions. Please send your questions via Slido. There will be assistance for you to do so, and then the moderator will curate the questions and send them back to me for some Q&A with the speakers. Include your name and organization in your question. And if you do want a particular panelist to address your questions, please include that in your questions. The discussion will be recorded so that it can be made available to a wider audience. I'm sure you appreciate there's quite a lot of competition this week for a virtual or indeed a live event. And so it's great to have the opportunity to share this discussion at a later stage with those who couldn't make it today. So let me introduce my first speaker, who is Mr. Brice de Schritere, is the head division of the Director of Integrated Approach for Security and Peace at the European External Action Services, that, as probably most of you know, is the European Union's diplomatic services and working on international affairs. So Brice, over to you for an initial 5 minutes pitch to help us understand this complex relationship between conflict and climate change. Thank you.
Well, hello, Marta, and good morning, everyone. And thank you very much, Marta, for the welcoming and for framing the discussion. I noticed that you started by framing the discussion talking about climate and mentioning you had a nice weather in London. As you can see behind me, it's not exactly the same in Brussels at the moment, as we have, through those dark clouds, a little bit of rain around. And you have also highlighted, I think, a number of points, notably that the urgency of the climate crisis is indeed becoming more and more evident to us. And I think on our side of the EU, we clearly have these assessments that we know now with certainty that climate change will have an impact on global peace and security. And therefore, more than ever, we need really now to move from words to actions and to address this challenge. I'll try to take this opportunity today, therefore, to explain how the EU, I mean, at least on the EAS side, is contributing to this work. And as you know, climate change is overall a strong political priority for the EU, obviously embodied by the European Green Deal. However, the presentation that I will do will rather focus on the EU efforts to understand and to address the convergence between climate change, environmental degradation, and security, which is a work that is also guided by the understanding that to achieve sustainable results, it needs to be addressed in a systematic and integrated way. So the first element I'd like to highlight is a concrete step on our end, as we adopted recently, and it was blessed by our member states, a concept for an integrated approach on climate change and security. It's a document that establishes the framework to integrate the climate and security dimension in all relevant policies and instruments of the EU peace and security work, or in other terms, within the tools that we are using in our crisis response. And this requires a new way of working. We're working along the entire conflict cycle, and also to readjust, readapt how we use our traditional crisis response and prevention tools. So the document is highlighting all those elements, in particular, prevention and peacemaking at heart of the action. And we seek to address the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation and the possible adverse effects of the green transition and adaptation as early as possible as we are looking at new situation. So the first element to highlight is we need to invest in enhancing anticipatory and mediation tools with more climate sensitivity. We have at the new level a whole mechanism for risk assessment, early warning system, conflict analysis that we're using for programming and also for dialogue in fragile states and regions. And a lot of the work that we're doing now is how we can incorporate better climate and environmental factors into those elements. A key factor, obviously, is to have the right gathering of data. And that's one of the points that we are now looking at, which is how we can improve the collection of data from the ground, notably from conflict areas, and integrate the elements that are pertaining to climate change and security into those data. Another aspect, as we look at a conflict cycle, is also how we can adopt our new EU approach to mediation and dialogue to better focus on climate and environment as a key arena for peacemaking. And in this respect, we are now introducing programs to better train our diplomats from member states, our EU officials, but also the people who are working on the programming of our financial tools and our mediators on climate issues. It is quite a steep learning curve to live up to this quite complex challenge, and it will take a certain time, but the efforts are now ongoing. In this respect, the second aspect I'd like to highlight is to actually draw your attention to the importance of the new EU funding instrument, the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, which is called NDICI, NDICI. And the climate commitments under this instrument will soon be increased with 4 billion euros, which actually translates into 35% of the overall budget that needs to be oriented towards tackling climate change. Of course, a lot of these money will be used to help with green transitions in a number of our partner countries. Nevertheless, it will also include actions aimed at preventing, addressing, mitigating this destabilizing effects of climate change on peace and security around the world. And in this, we have to be well aware that policy must lead, also such policy use of this instrument must lead to very context-specific actions so that we can mitigate the most immediate threats, but also so that we can anticipate in the future evolving needs of vulnerable populations. The third element I'd like to highlight here in this respect is that we cannot go along through such work alone. We need to have international partnerships. And I'd like to mention an example, which is the EU and the UNEP, who have worked together, in fact, since 2017, to develop tools and capacities to enhance environment and climate security analysis, and also for preventive action. And we have selected 2 pilot countries, Nepal and Sudan, on a project that is just coming to an end right now. And the proposed next phase will expand also geographically to deliver, the experience coming out of this project on science and environmental analysis to also inform both the EU and the UN conflict prevention and peacebuilding initiatives in several other regions. The project has notably led to the publication of a climate fragility risk assessment tool We have also identified a number of villages in Sudan and Nepal to implement pilot activities with practical action, notably for resilience building to climate security risks, and so on and so forth. I can come back with more details if there are specific questions later in this respect. This partnership is one of the first to take action on climate change and security at country and community levels, at least for us as an EU, and is combined with an engagement also to having more global policy influencing. As I mentioned, those pilot projects will be later on expanded.
Okay. 1 minute, please.
No worries. I'll come to an end very quickly. I think just to highlight perhaps in this respect that the lessons there and the impacts of climate change are cross-cutting, that you cannot have a policy successful without addressing the climate, peace and security dimension at the same time. I would say this nexus at the same time in terms of being more efficient in conflict analysis and conflict prevention. Well, maybe I will stop there just to say effectively this discussion is certainly a great opportunity to take that thinking further on the various intricacies on how we can address climate change and conflict, and also how to learn from each other. And I look forward to hearing then the perspectives from the other speakers and the reactions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brice. And it's great to actually start immediately with the policy space and what is happening in this case, what the European Union's policy approach is, but also some very useful references to data, to money, to funding, significant funding allocated to climate programming, but also the reality that that needs to also go through a number of priorities and not just, of course, addressing conflict and fragility and how do we make allocation effective, data, but also partnerships and projects on the ground. One thing that strikes me is that from the beginning here, and I think this is going to be true of many other conversations at COP, we have to reconcile the sense of urgency and the sense of the need for immediate action with the reality of addressing systemic issues that require long-term sustainable approaches. And in the case of conflict, that importantly focuses on prevention and mitigation, as well as addressing causes and drivers of conflict, as well as the phenomena and the events around conflict and fragility, as well as peace and the sort of the post-conflict period. So both at the same time, emergency and sustainability. So we now have the policy picture. I would love, by the way, other speakers to also react to this and also express their views on the adequacy of the policy framework that the European Union and partners are putting in place. But let me go over now to Dr. Johann Rockstrom, who's the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. He's also professor of Earth System Science at the University of Potsdam, to perhaps then help us sort of frame this concepts and the work the Institute does to translate them into practice. Over to you, Johann.
Yeah, thanks, Marta, and great to be with you. Greetings from the quite noisy blue zone here at COP26 in Glasgow. I want to share with you an initiative, a science initiative to support policy called Weathering Risk. And there should be a few slides just to provide you with some. Here we are. This is an initiative by the Potsdam Institute and together with Adelphi, with support of the Foreign Ministry in Germany. It's really about providing the evidence behind exactly Marta's framing of this session, that it's very complex processes. We don't have the full understanding of the causal links between climate change, social instability, migration, displacement, and conflict. But we have scientific evidence enough to say that global environmental change is an amplifier of social instability, which tends to show signs of displacements, migration, and conflict. And if you take the next slide, one of the, indicative pieces of evidence, and I could spend a long time on them, but this is just one piece of the weathering risk data that we're now gathering together, is just to showing you the drought index, the most dry regions in the world in the colored schemes here, And the dot-com schemes is over the last 20 years, armed conflicts around the world. And you can see a very strong correlation between vulnerabilities in terms of climate with social instabilities and conflict. I could have also laid over with you the latest climate assessments of business as usual global warming, showing that by 2070, in only 50 years' time, we will have 3.5 billion people living in regions which have more than 30 degrees Celsius of average mean temperature per year, which is a health threat. And these are the regions roughly corresponding to this map, actually, including large parts of Latin America. So you have a geopolitical threat, which we don't know exactly how it will play out, but it certainly puts a tremendous stress on particularly vulnerable societies that are already today having difficulties of coping with peaceful settlements in the current state of the climate. Next, please. So what we're trying to do in the weathering risk work is to advance the science here. We need to improve our understanding of the complex interactions between climate conflict and insecurity. We need to systematically address risk analysis, but also do foresights in terms of identifying future hotspot regions, but also how to prevent rapid, abrupt transitions into social instabilities and conflicts. So not to be exactly the price of when will it blow up in the next 1 to 10 years, but to be much better prepared at seeing the writing on the wall when we have an alignment of multiple parameters from the social and the biophysical space that show warning signs. And to put this in the context of the SDG agenda. Next, please. And when we are doing this work, we are recognizing the complexity and therefore the need for big data, multilateral, interdisciplinary research collaborations. And this is done, led by the Potsdam Institute and Adelphi, to do global big data risk mapping, identifying resilience of institutions, societies, communities, economies, but also looking at policy measures to address these vulnerabilities related to climate security. Next. And in so doing, we have broadened this partnership to a very significant extent. I won't go through the list here, but it's just to show that this is really requiring a very strong involvement, not only from scientific institutions, but also from more policy-oriented actors across our landscape. Next. So what are we trying to do here? Well, one is that we're developing a methodology for assessing risk. So I foresee that climate models, biophysical models, population economics, and risk models. We're working and interacting with SIPRI, for example, the Swedish International Peace Research Institute. We're looking at both short and long-term risks and trying to apply all the different types of methodologies that we today have at hand to be able to get a better handle on these risk planning and foresight analysis. And we're doing, zooming in different hotspot regions to try and see and test and validate the methodologies. Next. And with that, that's where we are. We're kind of in the midst of this work, and we look very much forward to getting also inputs and ideas from, in dialogues like this of how to move this agenda forward. So with that, back to you, Marta. Looking forward to the interactions.
Great, Johann, thank you. This was indeed very useful and stimulating. I think if there is one thing to avoid over the next couple of weeks and beyond, is to be complacent about the fact that when there is complexity, when there is sort of areas of evidence that require greater clarity, that we don't step away from the responsibility to use the evidence that we've got to take some action. And I think that what you presented, Johann, is such a good example of what can be done with the evidence across the policy community, the world of those who work operationally, and critically to really link the specific issues related to conflict and instability to some of the geopolitical dynamics at play. I think As I said at the beginning, and some of you might know, I have done quite a bit of work around migration over the last few years, and I'm really worried about us getting ring-fenced in some specific thematic discussions about the relation between climate and migration, climate and conflict, climate and water, very specific issues, and actually lose sight of the geopolitical dynamics. That map that you showed us earlier, Johann, shows so clearly it requires us to think much more systematically about what's happening in particular places where multiple dynamics are at play. And on that, let me advertise that on Thursday morning, we will have one of those thematic discussions that looks at the dynamic between climate and migration, but specifically in the Sudan or Sahel, precisely to try to address this geopolitical dimension when one looks at the combination of climate conflict and human mobility in combination. I would love, Johann, for us to carry on that conversation to make sure that we join efforts the way you're clearly doing through this large alliance that you're creating behind the Weathering Project initiatives. But let me now go over to Helen. So I'm decided I'm going to call you all by first name to make this friendly and lively and avoid overemphasizing titles. And from the International Committee of the Red Cross to perhaps bring the perspective of the humanitarian community and also those who work on the ground on the realities that people face when confronted with the multiple threats of climate change and instability and conflict. Thank you, Helen.
Well, thank you, Marta, and it's been really great to be part of the discussion. And I think some of the issues that you've framed and we've raised already, let's understand the temporal scope, that we've got to deal with the short term but the long term. Let's also not get stuck into binary discussions, as you noted so clearly, about issues and put them up against each other. So it's a real delight to be here. As people may not know, but as the International Committee of the Red Cross and my role as Director of International Law and Policy, with our mandate to work in times of armed conflict and other situations of violence, and 20,000 colleagues globally in places of conflict and violence, we see daily in our work that climate risks are growing and they're exacerbating people's vulnerabilities. So I think what I just wanted to flag briefly is that we really have the experience of people that are affected by armed conflict and violence are on what you'd say the front line of climate risks and are massively disadvantaged when it comes to adapting to climate change. And of course, the reasons are really obvious. I almost don't need to flag them, but I think it's important, as we keep talking about as a group this morning, to look at the weakening of institutions that result in this disadvantage to adapt, the lack of essential services, poor economies, lack of social cohesion, and the reversal, if we can put it this way, of development gains. So I think looking at it holistically and not simply drawing linear lines is really important. A couple of weeks ago, actually 10 days ago, I was in Somalia on mission, and we could clearly see the consequences of what we would call protracted conflict over a period of time, which has combined with the droughts and the frequent flooding, generated very big humanitarian needs. And we do see this pattern, if I may put it that way, in many places. From our research, we understand that 60% of the 25 countries that have been identified as the most vulnerable and least ready to adapt to climate change are those countries that are affected by armed conflict. So we have to look at the relationship, but in a wider context, as we all keep saying. And this is not because climate change is causing conflict. I think often people want to have that sound bite or that tweet. But I think it's because we need to investigate the limited capacity for these communities to cope with the shocks and adapt to the changes in countries that are experiencing conflict. So I think it's important to also put on the table here that armed conflict also directly or indirectly damages the natural environment. We've got many examples of conflicts recently and in the past in which damage the environment in the fighting itself, in the conduct of hostilities, and this is also have massive impact upon the population. So this is why one of the things I do need to raise is that respect for basic rules of international humanitarian law, or the laws of war, can protect the natural environment, and it's very critical. And in fact, yesterday I was addressing a very large group of military commanders, generals and above, flagging once again the importance of the military in looking at as they undertake their planning for operations, take into account the obligations to provide protections to the environment as well. So one of the things I think important to raise is that greater respect for the rules of international humanitarian law can in fact have an impact and limit environmental degradation. And I think let's not forget those elements. We have got, I would say, tools in our kit to already help us move forward, and often they're not put out and used enough. Just briefly to finish off a few other issues, I think we see the convergence of climate risks, environmental degradation and conflict really threatens people's lives and health, and has a flow-on effect with food, economic and water security. And somehow we're in a situation where the risks stemming from climate change, armed conflict and COVID, so we say there's 3 C's, climate, conflict and COVID, compound upon one another and really create impacted vulnerabilities. So as a humanitarian organisation, of course, we are forced, and we need to, but we're also forced to change how we work in this environment to ensure we respond effectively and manage the risks and address the urgent needs. And I think, as was mentioned before, this risks demand preventive and long-term thinking and response, as well as immediate strengthening of people's resilience. Several countries in the Sahel, and I was happy to hear that you mentioned this part of the world, in addition to providing emergency support where needed, ICRC is also helping farmers and herders cope with the increasing unpredictability of rainfall and periods of water scarcity by providing rehabilitation and irrigation schemes and production of animal feed, seed and storage. Now, that's not traditional work for an emergency humanitarian organisation, but we understand that we need to work on these issues as well. I think one thing I would also flag is the responses to help these communities are way beyond what humanitarian actors can, and I would argue should provide. I think adequate climate adaptation is intrinsically linked to inclusive development. And the challenge is that conflict-affected countries, development is often on hold. So it's got like a development stop because of the instability, and let's be honest, the insecurity, the dangers and the weaknesses of institutions. So we're in a little bit of a, I won't say a bind, but a real need to work together in a different way. And I think that because of the changes, we have to also adapt our own work. And I just wanted to flag here, one of the things we've been doing also is mobilising others to steer and scale up the response and working to really galvanise collective humanitarian action. And I just wanted to mention here what we worked with our colleagues in the International Federation, which is a climate and environmental charter for the humanitarian organisations themselves, for us to start looking at our own footprint and factoring that into our operations. And to date, this has been signed by over 170, yes, just over 170 humanitarian organisations around the world and getting support from states such as Switzerland. So we need to look at our own footprint. We need to understand the importance of collaboration. We've certainly worked with key stakeholders, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, researchers, as we're hearing today, and very important to use the evidence-based, states, but also development actors and communities. So the bottom line is that in order to address this problem, we really need to work together. We need to understand each other's mandates and modalities, but also at the edges where we can do things differently. I think the international community is very clear that we've agreed to leave no one behind, which means inclusive development and support must reach the places that are experiencing conflict, violence and fragility. So it's essential work, but I think discussions like this move us forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Helen. Let me ask the audience to begin sort of putting forward your questions, because soon enough I'll come back to you to ask your questions to the panel. But before I do that, I'd quite like to come back to each of you for the quick questions and some quick answers from you, and I'll deliberately do it in a slightly provocative way so that we can see if we can get to some of the challenges, actually, some of the dilemmas that we're confronted with. Actually, let me start with you, Helen, because what I would like to ask you is a direct follow-up of some of the things you just told us. You talked to us about the international system, rules and norms. You made reference to international humanitarian law, but also your work with the military. and the need for us to consider sort of the practices and the frameworks for inclusive development to work together. How do we do that, though? And what I mean is we have an international system where some of these institutions are not particularly well lined up to work together, where divisions persist. You know, I don't need to mention to you that the ongoing challenges of reconciling sometimes humanitarian sort of internet interventions and rules with ongoing development ones can be a challenge. So if we now bring in the urgency and the challenges posed by climate change, how do we make practical progress in ways that people can really feel the difference in the not too distant future on institutions and norms to work together better?
Well, thank you, Marta. I think this gets to the heart of some of the challenges we're all having. As I mentioned before, when I recently went on mission, even in places like Mozambique, too, we do see this interface coming together. So your actual question, if I had the answer to this, I would probably be queen of the world. So it's a good starting point. I think what I would come back to is it's about looking at the systems that we have at our disposal. And exactly as you said, I mean, there is a lot of, I would say, important and at times robust debate around the interface between humanitarian emergency work and I would say longer term development work. They have different frameworks. They often sit in different places in governments with funders, etc. And I think what we need to do, as I tried to flag, is understand by using evidence how there's an interlink. And so, for example, the work that we're doing around emergency relief has to have in mind and be programmed with sustainable impact in place. So one answer to your question is just continuing to understand each other. I think the development world doesn't always understand the stresses and the pressures that humanitarian emergencies have when everyone else is going out of a problems environment. Of course, groups like the ICRC or organizations are going in. So how can we understand each other better? We as the emergency need to understand what is the mind frame in setting up programs that take into account sustainable action. So the first one is collaboration, and that old saying that I grew up as an international lawyer and policy engager of, you understand issues such as, complementarity. I think we've got to lean in even more. And so one of the big issues I would say is the need to have continuum of efforts. This continuum that moves forward requiring the local, national authorities, humanitarian and development actors, plus the international financial institutions and donors to speak to each other, not put each other in boxes, but share analysis, manage risks in a complementary manner. So there's a lot more I can say on this, but that would be certainly a starting point, understanding that it's not one-off, it's continuum. And I think I must admit the development sector is ahead of us as humanitarians in integrating climate-related shocks into their approaches, but it does struggle to implement long-term responses in these places where we can get to. So somehow we need to, as humanitarians, on behalf of ICRC, not neglect our traditional focus of immediately saving lives, but factor those things in. I hope that's a starting point to kick off the conversation.
Thank you, Helen. My view on this is that I think we have an unprecedented opportunity with climate and the climate crisis to leave behind some of these divides and really sort of join forces for something that clearly affects the whole of humanity. So I cannot think of a better opportunity in the next couple of weeks in Glasgow to try to activate these collaborative efforts in unprecedented ways. Johann, let me come to you. And this question is close to the heart because it relates to evidence and science. And both you and I in different ways are in that business. And interestingly, you work both in academia, but also leading a think tank. And what you presented to us earlier showed us how much emphasis and how much effort you put in to bring together the different worlds of evidence, policy, and practice to work together. But to go back to evidence and the role of science, obviously there is a long history of the role of science and evidence in the climate debate, one where we've learned about science being manipulated, science being misused, and finally science being central to what we're trying to do. But this very science also tells us only so much and also points us to all sorts of different directions, and sometimes, not entirely clear relationships of causations or multiple variables and things that we need to still use to make a difference. So give me your sort of top three or your immediate thoughts about what you've learned about the role of science, perhaps the way you are working with it across your academic work as well as your policy-oriented research.
No, thanks, Martha. Well, to begin with, just to confirm, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's been quite a journey, particularly on the climate side, over the past 30 years, from much more prominent skepticism, denialism, manipulation, efforts of trying to, fake news in the scientific community was well known before it kind of ramped up over just the last years. At the same time, I mean, if there's something positive here in Glasgow, it is, of course, that we are in a more reassuring and solid position than ever before in terms of the scientific evidence, and therefore also the narrative and the messaging to policy businesses around the world that, it's not only that we have unequivocal evidence that we are causing the risks we're facing, but we also have so much more interdisciplinary science to show the way forward, not only in terms of the risks, but also in terms of the solutions. So I am currently, much less concerned about, let's say, the targeted, manipulations and debates that we've seen in the past, which of course are still around, but they really are today, I would argue, a small fringe minority of the big momentum we have, which is, the challenges we're facing today is actually that the majority of countries are not moving fast enough. It's not a question of holding back. It's more a question of the pace of change, and that's of course a much more constructive position to be in. The drama is just to hand back to you is that the topic of our discussions today are not really at the center stage of the negotiations. I mean, we're not talking about climate change impacts deep on equity, climate change impacts on stability of communities, climate change impacts on the risk of undermining life support systems to the extent that livelihoods really tip over well before the biophysical systems tip over. And we need to be much more eloquent scientifically to provide the evidence of that more complex substance. So it's, as you pointed out, it's not enough just to talk about temperature impact on water, temperature impact on food, temperature impact on energy. We need to somehow look at this in terms of societal development. But I think we're getting there. I think we're doing quite a good job in the scientific community to collaborate across disciplines. But as you know better than anyone, it's still a way until we have the ultimate answers. How to deal with that? Well, my advice is let's really apply precaution. I mean, deep uncertainty of catastrophic outcomes need to be managed with precaution. And that should also be something that we as scientists are very clear about. Uncertainty and low probability, high impacts does not mean that you are allowed to stand still. It means just that, very dangerous outcomes, we don't know them precisely because they're complex. So that is not an excuse for not acting.
Great, Johann. This is fascinating. We should definitely carry on this conversation, because having made all this progress on evidence and science and being so much more reassured, and having learned also about how to avoid the pitfalls of some of the manipulative effort to use that. And, as I said, I worked a bit on migration, so I couldn't be more painfully aware of the risk of manipulating evidence. And yet, getting those facts and those insights at the heart of political negotiations requires something more and something probably different that I think, as I said, we are learning to do, but will require perhaps a little bit longer. But this is where, I certainly don't want to paraphrase the Prime Minister of the UK, but if this is the beginning of something, also this is something with this COP that we take forward to make these negotiations sort of continue and ongoing into next year and beyond. But this, making the most of the progress on evidence and science seems to me such a powerful journey that the climate change community has gone through, that can really help us make a difference at the political level. And then to finish with politics, and back to you, please. And this question, I think, is political, because you might have heard that the multilateral system is in crisis, that COVID has somehow undermined our capacity collectively to address global issues with effective multilateral action. But obviously climate requires more than ever before the multilateral system to step up and deliver. So you mentioned to us before your work in partnerships and multilateral commitments. but I'm quite curious to hear your views from an EU perspective about the role of multilateralism in this COP ahead of us and generally in addressing the climate crisis going ahead. And then if I can get the questions on the chat, I'll make sure that we'll put them back. And if I don't get any, I'll carry on because I've got plenty to ask you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marta, for this question. Maybe I'd like to address it with two aspects. One, of course, is, as you mentioned, the multilateral dimension, and everybody has in mind the discussions at the UN Security Council at the moment in terms of a resolution, and the EU definitely has encouraged the UNSC to engage in climate change and security, and we fully support all member states that are now part of the UNSC to achieve this outcome. There's one other element to the question that I'd like to highlight maybe more. It's what we can do effectively on the ground in terms of international partnerships. If you take any crisis situation, you need to take this, I would say, through some sort of a matrix of the different aspects that it entails. There are different dimensions. Case here, as we are discussing, we're talking about climate, security nexus, environmental degradation. So that's a sort of multidimensional aspect. You have another aspect, which is at which phase of a given crisis situation you intervene. Are you talking about prevention? Are you talking about peace building, the response to the crisis itself? Are you talking about stabilization? And sometimes those different dimensions will interplay in the same situation. Take Sahel, for example, where all those dimensions must be played out. And then you also have to look at the level of your intervention. Sometimes you need a partnership that is international, indeed. Sometimes more at the regional, at the national, or at the local community level. So when you are talking about notions of partnership and cooperation, you really have to take this at all those different levels, global, regional, national, local, and look at what you can do as an actor well into these different dimensions and what others can come and complement as well. On the EU side, I would say our approach to multilateralism in this respect is not just to work with multilateral actors, meaning the UN, NATO, or the OSCE, or the African Union. And we do have a lot of dialogues and cooperation with them. I mentioned previously some pilot projects we're having, for example, with UNEP. It's also for us a question on all other key partners and how we integrate our own work with them, meaning our member states in the first stance, but also meaning with other international actors, research bodies, think tanks, and civil society. Obviously, I'm sure with the ICRC, or we will have other opportunities we speak as well of looking at those dimensions. And it's extremely important to highlight that we need to, every time there is a crisis situation occurring, to have the widest possible elements to improve our knowledge, to find the adequate solutions, and probably also we have to work later on how we can better engage with the private sector, especially at the local level, which is also a great opportunity to address this topic.
Great, thank you. And sorry if I looked a little bit distracted because I wanted to check on Slido the questions that are coming in. So thank you, please, for this. And actually, let me begin to share with you some of the questions that we're getting from the audience. And actually, I'll start with a couple that are specifically addressed to some of you. First of all, there are a number of questions and requests to post the links on the chat, for example, on the policy that you mentioned, please, at the beginning from the EU, and then maybe I wonder, Johann, also some details on the weather and risk work. So you can see them here. The slight problem with sharing the screen now is that I can't slide down, so I'll keep my link open. But Brice, you want to take the first question about what do you consider to be some of the important emerging trends that need to be mitigated? Obviously, it's a pretty broad questions, but perhaps pick a couple that you want to share with us. And then I will go straight to Johann on the question on weather and risk planning, whether you're planning to do action research to assess what works and what doesn't in conflict-affected areas. And then finally, Helen, the questions about the continuum of effort mentioned by you to be monitored. How in practice is that going to happen through the SDGs, the UN? Who is going to be in charge of the monitoring. So over to you, Brice, and then Johann, and then Helen, and then we'll take some of the broader questions I'll put back to all of you for a closing round. Thank you, Brice.
Great. Thank you very much, Marta, and thanks a lot to the person who asked this question effectively on the important emerging threats. I think as was highlighted also by other speakers, the risks stemming from climate change are very multiple and complex. We can think of land degradation and desertification. We can think of water scarcity, the rise of levels of water, and notably in the coastal areas. Also the loss of biodiversity, and overall the multiplication of extreme and unusual weather events, be it floods or extreme waves of heat that are directly affecting crops and have a very big impact, especially in fragile regions. I think we need to think of how to address that. And if we are thinking on how to address that, don't forget that the impacts are generally very context-based. What I mean here is that the threats are not the same wherever you are. The threats, sorry, are not the same wherever you are in the world. It's not the same in Bangladesh, for example, where you're suffering more from floods, from storms, or what's happening in the countries in the Sahel region, where droughts or unpredictable rain patterns can also cause severe impacts on societies. And bearing in mind these context-specific differences, we probably need also to look at the consequences and to focus on the impacts it has in terms of loss of livelihoods, in terms of food insecurity, and in terms of displacement of people. And Marta, you are an expert on migration, so I will not get and venture into this field, but we have quite impressive figures, notably in sub-Saharan Africa, of people who seem to have been forcibly displaced from climate change impact, and notably from the droughts, and it's in the terms of the millions. So many of the climate change related phenomena have very detrimental impacts on food insecurity, on livelihoods. This may provoke migratory movements. This can in turn fuel the risk of community-based violence, increase social, political, and economic negative factors, especially in rural areas. So the risk really can be very much interlinked. There's just another question here, which is in relation to climate change and security with cultural heritage. We have also worked on those notions of cultural heritage at the EU level. You may have seen we actually published last year a specific concept on this dimension, and we are looking at the links effectively between cultural heritage in conflicts and crisis, and the link that it has with the negative impact of climate change in the document that we have released in our concepts on climate change and security. And one of the elements I'd like to raise, I mean, I know I just have 30 seconds, so I will go fast, but it's also to have an element, I would say, of optimism, in the sense that the communal efforts towards preservation of cultural natural heritage from climate change and environmental degradation can also act as a proactive element for building and securing peace and bringing local communities together more strongly than it would be the case otherwise. So I think we also need to, as we are looking at the implications of the work we do, take it from the other angle and see also what opportunities we can try to build on when addressing those risks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brice. And I'll ask both Johann and then finally Helen to pick up the specific question, perhaps anything else as a final comment. And so, Johann, you have a specific question about the weather and risk work and planning to do action research and what works, but also why don't you take the questions about whether we can expect to see an increase around conflict while there is a general trend of, which can, of course, can be debated, but there is a general trend of somewhat decreased level of armed conflict or certain types of armed conflict. Are we saying that we expect to see an increase as a result of climate change or failure to adapt and mitigate effectively? Johann, over to you for your final remarks.
Yeah, thanks. So on the first question there, on the action research, I think it's fair to say that the answer is no. If we by action research understand really applied field research on the ground to really, let's say, build mitigation tools to avoid conflict or instabilities related to climate and other environmental changes. What we will do, however, is to have dialogues in different geographic regions in the world to pick up and learn from the ground and kind of validate the methodological advancement. So it's more, you could think of it as more kind of a multi-layered top-down methodological development, which is then grounded in dialogues on the ground. But we're not assuming that we can also find applied solutions on the ground. So that's something to develop in partnership with other institutions. When it comes to the broader question, I think that's the big question. I mean, are we at risk of following a trajectory even at 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, continuing to transgress planetary boundaries, meaning undermining fresh water, biodiversity, soils, air pollutants? What will be the risk of higher severity of social conflicts? Question mark. I mean, I think it's fair to say that we don't have the answer, but if we look at the trajectories, if we look at the indicative evidence we have, the answer is certainly yes, because just like we've seen so far historically, I think if we project that into the future, we'll see more turbulence related to this combination of impacts of vulnerable social constructs hitting vulnerable biophysical constructs, and that is a very bad mix that we want to avoid at all costs.
Thank you very much, Johann, and I think this goes back to what we were discussing earlier about evidence, right? That the evidence is still, of course, the jury's out in some way, but I think we need to take these indications seriously and put effort into preventing the increased risk of conflict. Helen, let's finish with you with the specific questions about what we're going to use, what indicators we're going to use to monitor efforts and the SDGs and the UN, and who else has a role. You mentioned community earlier. I wonder whether you got some thoughts on that, and then any final thoughts you might have in about 3 minutes if you can, and then I'll just share very final thoughts for all of you. Thank you.
Certainly, and thank you for that question. I think it's foundational, because as we all want to, as I think we have to understand, at the moment it's not just about continuing to talk, it's about action, and obviously monitoring is a very good interface with action. What I would say on this issue, though, is if we actually analyse what we're talking about in this continuum, the states that have already been identified in being the most need of support, so we would argue the least developed states, the states experiencing conflict, are already identified as needing existing commitments under frameworks such as the SDG, the Paris Agreement, and others. So I think putting our energy at the moment into creating a monitoring mechanism perhaps isn't the place where, certainly from the ICRC perspective on the ground, we'd add most. I think what we need to do is look at existing obligations and make sure they're pushed hard. And here I want to flag issues around, for example, weapons, around international humanitarian law, the obligations not to use landmines and others, which have a big impact upon the capacity for communities to use the land and therefore, or not use the land and therefore over farm in other areas. So I think we've got a range of existing obligations which we need to monitor heavily. But as I think we're all saying, it's more about the encouragement, exchange, discussion, the sharing of experiences, and also risk analysis. And I think about diversifying the actors we work with. And I did want to flag that I think in the area of evidence, which is very, very important today, and a number of us have spoken about it, I think it's we don't want to forget the added value humanitarian organisations like the ICRC can have in providing evidence because of the valuable fact that we're on the ground, we're in the present. So I think it's bringing together those that are working on it already. It's having a both short-term but also long-term mind frame. And it's also about looking at what are the existing obligations that we can lean into that will make our benefit in this. And in the last minute, I wanted to flag the importance of cultural property. I think that's a critical issue as well. So back to you, Marta.
Thank you. And I have literally 1 minute left to, first of all, thank you all. Thank you, the panelists, Johann, Rhys, and Helen, for a fascinating discussion. We started with the risks of having a somewhat nebulous discussion about the fact that the evidence, was mixed, and that we needed to be cautious about drawing simplistic causal relationship between climate change and conflict. But I'm very, very pleased that we emerge at the other end of this discussion with a set of very concrete ideas, things that are happening. We heard about the policy, the programming, the financing that the European Union is putting in place, considering and learning to do it in practice, also in its multilateral work. I think the Weather and Risk Assessment Initiative is such an important and concrete step to get people together on the important sort of role and work that foresight and assessment can bring to this work. And that is matched by, Helen, what you just said about the fact that gathering evidence from those on the ground will continue to be important and actually inform, I suppose, some of the work that Johann and others are doing. So a session on complex issues that points to so many concrete ideas and commitment, what we can do in practice, is certainly certainly gives us hope and a sense of potential, what can be done. COP is not the last session that will focus on conflict and climate. I mentioned earlier, I guess Johann and others will be involved in the German pavilion tomorrow, so please follow that. And with that, I want to have my final word to thank the European Union, and particularly the External Action Services, for organizing this virtual event. And I very much hope to continue this conversation with some of you, hopefully in person one day soon. So thank you all very much, and to the audience for the interesting questions. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Bye there.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Look forward to working together.